Alrighty, we're on lesson 5, and tonight we will get a little bit deeper and a little bit further into all of this apologetics. Last time we talked, what did we all get into really that would kind of help bolster the reliability of the Bible? What did we talk about a lot last time? Okay.
Historical references.
Yep.
Government.
Okay.
Historical references.
Yep. Who were we looking at with some of those?
Luke.
As far as the writer. Yeah, Luke, right? Luke writes very extensively, like 20-something names that he drops of very important people, prominent people, notable people in history. You can look back at history. It's documented. All of that stuff is there, either through writings, either through inscriptions that they find in stone. They skeptics and critics question these things, and then, well, lo and behold, we have another inscription that's found that proves that Luke was correct and true. So that really is very, very powerful when you're talking to somebody maybe that, hey, you ought to look into some of what Luke wrote about. If you're kind of questioning this or questioning that, it wouldn't be the first time, and so you can send people Luke's way. Anyway, but hopefully all of that has even strengthened you. Again, not that we maybe need all of this stuff, but I mean, to be honest with you, that's maybe one of the first times that I've looked that extensively at all of that stuff, and it just kind of strengthens all of my stuff now. I'm like, wow, yeah. And now, maybe whenever you're reading through Acts or Luke, you can see some of these names of people. You see some of the places that he writes about, and you're like, oh, you know what? There's an inscription about that. They found that. That's real. That's real stuff. I think it really just brings it all to life when you really start seeing this stuff. Archaeology does that. Again, I told you we may watch a video maybe of the Bible Land passages that, if any of you are familiar with John Moore, he has started some of that. He's been doing it for a while, but man, they're on site in Jerusalem, in Israel, and all of that. They're going to these places, and they have this informational video about them. I mean, they're standing and they're reading it, and they're standing there. I mean, that brings it all to life, So has anybody ever been to Israel? In here? No? Nobody? Man, yeah, I want to go. I mean, I think that's a bucket list thing right there. I would love to go. We almost had an opportunity to go after school, but it's expensive. It's expensive to go. But they do have groups that you can go with. Actually, John Moore takes groups all the time, and sometimes they'll hit Israel, and then they have another one, as far as I know, they'll go to like Greece, and they'll hit Rome and different. So anyway, it's really, really neat, but yeah, it's pricey. So anyway, I want to now kind of move on into another area of apologetics that I think is one of the stronger areas to look into when you're trying to prove maybe a few things about Jesus or some things about Christianity, especially early Christianity and how things were going back then. Okay, and again, it comes from outside the Bible sources that talk about things that are in the Bible and people that are in the Bible. And again, why is it important when dealing with skeptics to show things and give evidence outside of the Bible? Why is that important? Pretty straightforward. They don't believe in the Bible, right? They question the Bible, okay? Yeah, I mean, that's the basic bottom line. They just don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in its claims, and they don't believe in the things that it says, okay? So they don't think that it's a trustworthy source, okay, because they believe it may have been tampered with or something like that, and we've talked about that. And that's fine. That's fine. That's completely fine if they want to think that, because I get it. I get where I understand, okay? It's okay if they are not convinced yet, and we need to be okay with that, okay? Again, not everybody has grown up like we maybe have grown up, okay? But you do have to use other things that they don't have those sort of thoughts about, okay, and feelings about that do point to things that the Bible does mention and talk about. Make sense? Okay. And that would be what we would call corroborating evidence or sources, okay? Which is basically that which confirms or supports or perhaps it strengthens the reliability of a claim, an event, or a conclusion or something that makes it even more trustworthy. Okay, it just adds to it, right? In this case, it would be corroborating evidence or sources that strengthen, support, or affirm things about the Bible. That makes sense? That you're looking at extra things that support and affirm and confirm what the main thing says. Yes, sir.
Some of these major critics of it, who do they say wrote it then?
Depends on who you ask, honestly.
Man,
The
yeah.
popular answer is that Rome commissioned it, that Rome got Paul to write things that were dissenting from Judaism and things like that in order to cause division and stir things up. That's kind of the popular thing that's going around right now. That Rome commissioned the
Yeah.
Bible, essentially.
Yeah. They certainly don't believe that those men wrote it, or if they did, they weren't inspired people and God didn't lead them to write and so forth.
Somebody else.
Sure. Yeah. Anyway, so these sources, they are things that are separate from the Bible. They are uninspired sources. Let's just make sure we understand that, okay? But they do help bolster it, okay? They're not inspired, but they help bolster it. So we're strictly talking about documentation that is out there about early Christianity. It's no different than just looking at a history book. You want to read about the Civil War, you want to read about whatever war. What do? You go grab a history book. Well, it's kind of the same deal, okay? The Bible is history, all right? So people wrote about it. It's not a standalone book necessarily. All right, so that's what we want to look at now. These sources, or people rather, that wrote about Jesus, wrote about early Christianity. They were very close to the writers of the New Testament. They were the first people, basically, that were writing about it all shortly after the apostles, all right? In fact, some of them may have even known some of the apostles personally, which is really awesome. And we'll get to that. But we are talking about guys that lived and wrote anywhere from like the late 1st century on into the 4th century. So like 100-ish to like 300-ish in that span. Okay? So, in that time frame. Anyway, so some corroborative sources. Who do you have? You've got really 3 groups of people. Depending on who you talk to, they may rope the first 2 into one. But you've got what's called apostolic fathers. That's kind of guys from 70 to like 150, around there. These are very general dates. But and then you have early church fathers. And then you've got people also thrown into that time frame that are also called apologists. Okay? And we'll get into those. But I really just kind of want to answer a few questions about each one of these groups, and then like as we move on, and then look at some of the more prominent people, and then look at kind of what they have written that had to do with the early church and so forth. All right, but before we get into it, and just so you know, the nature really of all of these extra writings, I would say, was very intentional. When you start digging into some of this stuff, intentional because the problems that the apostles dealt with, both in the church and like out of the church, so internal and external, such as like Judaizers. You know who the Judaizing teachers are? Right? Does that ring a bell? Okay. There you go. Very well. Like in Galatians, you got them. Who were still trying to force the law of Moses onto people. Basically, if you can't really be a Christian unless you're circumcised. You can't really be saved unless you have that. That's kind of what they were pushing. This whole thing, what Acts 15 is all about at the Jerusalem Council, and then Galatians as well, as Gloria said. So you had those things. You had, some legalism getting thrown around. You also started to have some more Greek philosophy that was kind of creeping its way in. You had different forms of heresies that were having to be fought against, such as Doceticism and Ebionism. You also had adoptionism and Gnosticism and antinomianism. I mean, a lot of these isms, okay, and we're not going to go into all of those at the moment, but some of those were just teachings that really challenged either Jesus' humanity or they challenged the divinity of Jesus. Those teachings that were coming up and arising, okay? The antinomianism even was this kind of distorted teaching of grace. You could just kind of live how you wanted, and, well, grace has got you. You kind of see that in Jude. You kind of see that with Paul in Romans chapter 6 a little bit. Shall we sin that grace may abound? No. We should not do that. All right? But the apostles were dealing with some of that even as they lived. Okay, and we read about that. You see Paul handling the Judaizers. You've got John handling Gnosticism stuff in his epistles. Peter writes about false teachers. Jude does as well in his short letter. So there were problems already that had to be addressed. They were addressed. Teachings and thoughts that had to be fought against with even with the apostles when they lived. But after they were gone and dead and everything, that didn't necessarily go away. All that mess didn't necessarily stop, okay? You still had these issues, and you still had these false teachers and teachings to deal with. So these apostolic fathers, okay, these early church father guys, it's almost like they just kind of took up the mantle. Okay, they kind of just took it up upon themselves to try and combat some of these things. And that's what you see in a lot of their writings. There was always this fight, really, to keep and hold to what the apostles laid down, because that was right. Okay, and they had gotten it from Jesus. Of course it was right. But of course, just as Paul said would happen, departure from the faith started happening. So there's always really kind of been this battle that has gone on to keep and hold to and preserve the true gospel and the true nature of Jesus and the truth overall, really, because other heresies would pop up and they would have to fight that again. And as you know, that is still going on, even today, all right? We face actually a lot of the same pressures, both internal and external, in the church and out of the church. I mean, the church still struggles today with things, in some places, with things like legalism, and they struggle with in liberalism too. But in tradition and binding things, and you can't do this and be a faithful church, or you can't do that and be a faithful church. That still goes on, okay, even today. But then also on the outside of the church still battles different doctrines that come up, okay? People still twist and they still distort teachings that do not line up with the New Testament apostolic teaching. There's truly nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes says. It might be under a different name today. It might not be the same ism, but it's basically the same teachings of that ism, right? So it's really interesting. You do actually have a lot of the same thoughts and philosophies that even way back then they were dealing with. So you see those things. What I'm saying is, when you start digging into the fathers and all that, that's what you see. They're battling all of these heresies, and they're trying to encourage the church still, and so forth. But it's really, really interesting to look at these. Anyway, why are they called? Let's just look at the apostolic fathers. Why are they called that? The apostolic fathers are called that because they pretty obvious, but because they lived during or immediately after the apostles. Okay, they were not apostles themselves. What they wrote is not inspired. It is not authoritative, like the Bible is. But they are close to those guys in time. Okay, so they are people that followed what they taught, the apostles. That is, they were influenced very heavily from some of the apostles, and as I said, perhaps even knew them personally. Some of them did. Okay, and as far as who a lot of their writings are addressed to, well, there were Christians that they would write to, and also there were other congregations that they would write to. Much of their writings had to do with unity, had to do with Christian behavior, and teachings that may have been needed to be reinforced. But in a lot of the same way that the apostles wrote to the churches, they were kind of doing the same thing. I said, picking up kind of where they had left off. Okay. All right. Now, we may get done early, Bill Sherman. Okay, let's kind of talk about some of the key figures. We won't really get into some of the things that they really said tonight. We'll do that in subsequent lessons, but I just kind of want to open you up and introduce this to you as to who some of these people were. So the first one really, and some of the key figures, Clement of Rome. Anyone ever heard of this man? Okay. Maybe one of the more popular ones. It's in the Apostolic Fathers, but wrote around 95 AD, so late 1st century there. It is believed, everybody turn to Philippians chapter 4. Okay, look down at, somebody read Philippians chapter 4 and look at verse number 3. It is believed that that's the same dude, Clement of Rome. I don't know how solid everybody is on that necessarily as far as scholars go. I don't think people have really came down and said in the affirmative that is who that is. But it's pretty strikingly, it's pretty compelling, at least. Clement. Okay, so perhaps a companion of Paul's, knew Paul perhaps, so that's pretty neat. His work actually is First Clement, okay, 1 Clement, and it was addressed, when you start reading it, if you pick it up, you'll see that it was addressed to the Corinthian church, who were really dealing with some internal strife. Let's see, yeah, and really trying to kind of restore some order there at Corinth again. I mean, Paul dealt with the same thing, did he not? Had 2 letters written to Corinth. At least 2. Yeah, there you go. We know of, right? But here comes Clement. Boy, Corinth's at it again. They got some problems. I mean, I can't imagine Corinth. I'm sure it was quite wild back then. But anyway, so that's what he wrote about. He is a key figure and known as one of the Apostolic Fathers. The next person you will find, by the way, I didn't have it in here, but if you're trying to find where these people are written about, there's really a collection of books. They're known as the Ante-Nicene Fathers. You can write that down in the additional notes section, maybe on your outline. Ante, not I, A-N-T-E dash Nicene. Before Ante, the Nicene Council of 325. That's really all that means. And then you have post-Nicene, which would be after. Okay, and there's guys that wrote during that period as well. But that's where you can find them. I have it on my Bible software, but that's kind of built into it. I really don't know where, a library maybe a theological library. Do you know maybe where you could find one of those books? We might have one here.
Books.
Do what?
I got mine on Thrift.
Really? Okay, yeah,
I got Polycarp. I got
Okay.
a bunch of the early church writers.
sweet,
Justin Martyr.
sweet.
Ignatius.
Okay, yeah, so probably, I mean, Amazon obviously, thrift books, different websites, probably, some Christian book maybe, may have some historical books like that you could pick up and find. If you're into that sort of thing, it's really interesting to go and read about. Really, really it is. And honestly, they're not very long. They're not that long. They're quite short letters actually, but yeah, for the most part. But anyway, so that's where you can find them. Ante-Nicene Fathers. Okay, you can find those works and those books. The other one, the next guy in the Apostolic Fathers, you will find a big name, Ignatius. Ignatius of Antioch. All right? He writes around 107, 110. So that's still very, very close, right? To them, somewhere in that period. Ignatius actually has seven different letters that he wrote. But what's interesting about him, he wrote them as he was on his way to Rome to martyrdom. Yeah, so he's on his way to be executed, and he's like pumping out urgent letters. Now, back then, Rome allowed you to have visitors. I think they stopped maybe at Smyrna, and then another place also. So it wasn't like full lockdown, no visitors, you're going to die. Because that was my question. I was like, well, how could they actually get these letters out to these churches if he was on lockdown? Well, they did allow visitors. If you remember when Paul was at Rome, yes, he's on house arrest, but he did have visitors that were able to come. So Rome kind of still functioned like that. It wasn't, they were just the guards taking the man. But anyway, Ignatius writes while he's on his way to Rome to be executed. In fact, one thing mentions the beasts at Rome I'm headed toward. Now, it's not confirmed that he was going to the Colosseum. There were other places that Rome also had for sport, essentially, like that. But anyway, so he's got 7 letters. Picked him up at Antioch, headed to Rome, probably for not worshiping the emperor. If you didn't worship the emperor and Rome caught wind of that, well, you're probably going to die. If you didn't, hail Caesar or whatever. So anyway, that's probably why he was picked up. But he was picked up in Antioch around Syria. And then he writes these letters to the Ephesians, I'm not even sure who some of these are, but Magnesians, Trallians, Romans, Philadelphians, Smyrnians, and then he wrote one actually to Polycarp of Smyrna, and that was an individual letter to him. Actually, they were contemporaries. They were close together. So anyway, they were kind of friends. Anyway, Ignatius, in his letters, he's really urging for unity. He warns against false teaching. In almost all of these apostolic fathers, early church fathers, that's what you see. They are battling this stuff over and over and over again. All right? So, and he tries to tell them to be grounded in the faith and so forth. So, again, they're picking up the mantle right where the apostles left off. They cared about this stuff so much, right? They're writing about it. They want it preserved. Okay? So, and there's some, thoughts we could think about there. All right, so you've got those 2 guys. The next man is this guy here, Polycarp. Polycarp of Smyrna. He wrote his letter to the Philippians. That would have been somewhere around 110, 135-ish. But he also writes to them to stay true to the truth, stay true to righteous living. He has a lot of other scripture references also in his writing. So there's a bit of what Paul wrote in his to the Ephesians. He's got some things in there that in 1 Peter that he wrote. He's got stuff that came from 1 John. He references Romans. And all that's very interesting because it kind of tells you how they viewed what was already circulating and in place. They're already referencing this stuff as Scripture. Well, this is like 110, around that area. So they're already considering these works and writings from the apostles authoritative. They're referencing them. Anyway, now something that is interesting and that's said about Polycarp is actually from a guy that had sat underneath him named Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is another player in this, but Irenaeus had written something. Actually, there's so many names that get thrown around in here, but if you know the history, it's interesting. But it comes from something that Eusebius had said in his writings that Irenaeus said. That's a bit technical. But anyway, listen to what he says. This is Irenaeus speaking about maybe his mentor, you could see it as Polycarp. Okay, check this out. Okay, Irenaeus has this letter, and he's writing to this guy named Flornius or something like that. Anyway, it starts with an F. And basically, he's this guy that Irenaeus is writing to has kind of started getting into some heresies that was not what he didn't need to be in. And he's writing to him. And he talks about this time whenever he was younger. And he talks about this time when he was a boy. And he's like, man, I wish I remembered his name. He's like, but anyway, he's like, I remember this time whenever I was a boy. And you were up there, we were all down at Asia Minor. And you were high up and had high status, but we were all at this place where Polycarp was talking. And he's reminding this man of this. It's a really interesting little tidbit in this letter. But he said, so he's going on about that. And he says, I could describe, like back in his childhood, he said, I could describe the very place in which the blessed Polycarp sat and taught. He's talking about that day. His going out and coming in, the whole tenor of his life, his personal appearance, how he would speak of the conversations he had held with John and the others who had seen the Lord. How did he make mention of their words and of whatever he had heard from them respecting the Lord? That's really, really neat to me. He's writing to his friend, this guy, and he's like, you remember, you were there, we were there. And I remember Polycarp talking about how he would tell us about the conversations that he had with John the Apostle and other people who had seen the Lord as well. He's like, don't you remember that? Actually, it's kind of funny because later on in that same letter, he's like, and dude, I'm hardcore paraphrasing, but he's like, man, if Polycarp now could hear what you are getting into and talking about, he would come unglued. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. And he kind of just rips this guy. He's like, this would not fly, what you're getting into. These guys really stuck up for the truth. And if somebody, and by the way, this Irenaeus is younger than this man that he's actually writing to. He said, I was a boy, but you were in high status at that point in time when we were at that day there in Asia Minor. He's writing to him saying, you need to not with this stuff. Anyway, really cool stuff. Eusebius writes about some of that stuff. He's another player. Anyway, anyway, I was talking to Alex all about that today. This is exciting. I just find it exciting. With this stuff, it's a look and it's a window into something we're not used to seeing because they're so close to those people. And when they write about some stuff, it's like, what are you writing? Oh my goodness. You knew John. You knew that, it's exciting. I think it's exciting. Anyway.
So how do we use this as an extra scriptural evidence when it's almost right in Scripture, if you understand what I'm saying? They're sitting next to Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
How do they make the application of what we're
Well, and that's kind of what we're going to get into later. Some of the things that they actually write about. I just wanted to kind of show you the players and who they were. But when you start looking at what they wrote about, because some people are skeptics and they're critics about Jesus and some of the, things to do with the church and early Christianity and so forth. But when you see that, hey, here are some of these outside, separated away from the Bible people writing about what these so-called Christians, this cult sometimes they would reference to, here's what they're doing. It just adds and it bolsters a bit more to this whole thing about Christianity. Does that make sense? I think that might make more sense later when we start actually looking at some of what they wrote. For instance, they talk about like the system or the protocol they would do whenever, like, I think Pliny maybe writes about this, but whenever they would confront Christians, they'd be like, look, you can renounce it right now or you're going to die. And I don't remember who, I think it's Pliny the Younger that was writing to Trajan. Anyway, I think so. But anyway, there are things like that that are just, okay, these guys are writing about some things that, it happened. So a skeptic would need to consider some of these writings too, just like they would need to consider the things that Luke found.
I think the other thing, though, too, that is helpful is that these writings are the ones that survive in addition in addition to the scriptures.
Yeah.
Right? And they're older than a lot of like the Gnostic texts that people will try to bring up as a way of diminishing the legitimacy of scripture.
Yeah.
Saying, well, they left this out. Well, this was newer.
Yeah.
Over here, and it was left out for good reason.
Very good reason.
And it's addressed by all of these early writers.
Yeah.
So that's one way to handle it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, good question though. All right. So let's see. That's Polycarp. Okay. Seems to be that Polycarp had a close relationship with John the Apostle. Maybe even was taught by John. Remember, John lived up until like 90s in that area. Died at Ephesus, or I guess Patmos, but yeah. So he's there as an older man now, teaching some of these young bucks some of what the doctrine was and all of that stuff. And that's why they're always kind of referencing John, like, hey, I knew John, man. So that's really interesting. But that's why kind of looking at these guys and what they wrote has some merit to it, because they were that close to the apostles. Okay, so yes, it's uninspired, but boy, what they write about is like, this is cool. This is interesting. All right, the other one, Papias of Hierapolis, 95 to 120. One of his main works, really, and he contemporary to Polycarp, but one of his main works. Exposition of the oracles of the Lord. He's got a 5-volume set on that, but it's kind of broken up into fragments, really. Anyway, he's just another one. All right, so then you get into some of the early church fathers, okay? Again, they're kind of distinguished a little bit, but some people rope them together. Anyway, but they too dealt with heresies. They dealt with some philosophical thinking that was creeping in, trying to preserve what had been handed down. So they were defending a lot. These guys were. I've mentioned Irenaeus, 180. His major work is called Against Heresies, okay, of which there are 5 books in that work, mostly dealing with false teachings, but especially Gnosticism. That really taught that there was some sort of secret knowledge that people could have for salvation. The actual physical matter around you was kind of evil, but there's a spiritual realm that's better and good. And since the material world is evil, well, the true God wouldn't have created that. It taught a whole different view of Jesus. There's a lot of layers. There's a lot of layers to this whole Gnosticism thing. John, we find, writes about some of it in his epistles, but Irenaeus kind of handles that and really dismantles a lot of that teaching. Then you've got Clement of Alexandria, so Clement of Rome and Clement of Alexandria, 190, 215. He kind of puts some deeper thoughts to Christianity. He approaches it with a more kind of a philosophical approach. Tries to teach Christians how to think deeper and how to live better. That was kind of his area. All right, he's got 3 different works that he has for that. You've got this man, Tertullian, 197 to 220. He's a big defender of Christianity. Also fought some heresies with him. I'll just kind of fly through these real quick. But Origen was another one. He's kind of regarded as both an early church father and an apologist. So another defender of the faith. But he was a deeper thinker, defended Christianity. He wrote on matters of theology for the church also. He did put together, though it may not have been the first commentaries, but he did put together a commentary of John and one of Matthew. Okay. Hippolytus of Rome, his main work is Refutation of All Heresies. I mean, this is like every one of them are having to write about this stuff. Heresies, heresies, heresies. What's coming in? Shut it down. So he's similar to Irenaeus, actually, with what he did. Then you've got Cyprian. He handles some unity in the church. Talks a lot about some church discipline, restoration, leadership, things like that, and during a time of persecution, actually. But anyway, we'll stop right there. Got a few more to mention. We'll save for next time. But a lot of these guys back then, they're quite similar to what we have today. We have guys throughout the Brotherhood that write. We have guys that write about church discipline. We've got guys that write about church this and church that. I mean, we have the same kind of thing today, and we've got a whole entire website now for apologetics, just refuting a lot of atheistic stuff and doctrines like that. These guys were just doing that pretty much back then, okay? Stuff that was coming up, and trying to infiltrate the church. They cared about the church. They loved the church. They knew some of the apostles. They probably, I would venture to say, they were probably Christians themselves in the correct sense, probably. And they're trying to make sure everything is solid still. And they fought for this stuff. And they died for this stuff. A lot of them were martyrs. They got killed for it. For upholding the truth and fighting these heresies. But anyway, so I hope we can appreciate some of this stuff. I hope we can appreciate the work that they did and the just fighting through all the mess that they fought through just to try and keep and preserve our Bible and what's true and the doctrine and all that stuff. So anyway, that'll be that. So thank you.